Alright folks, let's go ahead and get this thing started. So what I wanted to do today is make a video talking a little bit about what I'm calling internet cold weather survival experts. And for the record, I'm not an expert, I'm just a regular guy. So what had happened was, like I like to do in my spare time, is watching a couple of YouTube videos. And I came across a couple of videos of some rather popular fellas, and they were doing some lessons or some teaching about cold weather survival. And there's a couple of different things that I heard them say that I found startling and then somewhat alarming, because in my opinion they were throwing out some rather bad advice that could potentially be dangerous. And so let me go ahead and explain. First guy was talking about sleeping out in the cold, and he was talking about 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, somewhere right around that range. And some of the techniques that he was recommending were contrary to conventional wisdom and long-standing beliefs. And like moisture protection and condensation management. And so when you're out in the cold, the thing that you really got to worry about is getting hypothermia and dying, croaking. And you want to make sure that you stay dry. I think that's the most important thing that anybody says. Like, you don't want to work too hard and sweat, get the hypothermia. You don't want to fall in the water and get wet and die of the hypothermia. And you don't want to put yourself in a scenario where you're trapping moisture or condensation from your body, especially when you're sleeping, and then wake up with the hypothermia and die. And this guy was making some recommendations about using things like Mylar blankets inside your sleeping bag, or using Mylar blankets as barriers. And listen, I don't have a problem with Mylar blankets or space blankets, and I definitely understand that they can be used quite effectively to keep you warm. But what happens is that when you put these things, like say in the bottom of your sleeping bag or inside your sleeping bag on top of you, you can cause a perspiration scenario where your body excretes moisture, and then your skin is wet, then your clothes are wet, and then once that happens, I think they say it's 1/3 as hard to keep your core body temperature up. The other thing is the guy was recommending kind of building a cocoon or a nest around you. And what that can do is it can trap your breath. And so at nighttime, when you're cold and you're breathing out warm air, you get condensation, and it can build up rapidly. And a lot of times it'll fall back down on you, and then your clothes, your sleeping bag, your blanket, or whatever you have, then gets wet. And he was saying, no, what happens is that the condensation builds an ice barrier, a little protective shell, and he was saying that the materials that he uses kind of wick away the moisture from the breath, and I just don't see scientifically how that's possible. And then I think that the type of cloth that he was using, once you get moisture there, is going to freeze, and I don't think that ice is a wicking type material or a wicking type environment. And I really just think it's a recipe for disaster. And the guy went on to say that, hey, I sleep outside all the time, and I do this all the time. And, you know, I think that he was surviving a night in the cold despite his setup, not because of his setup. And that kind of leads into a little bit of a philosophy that I have, which may not be right. And it really goes into, in these types of scenarios, you're either dying, you're surviving, or you're thriving. And I don't know about y'all, but when I'm out in an uncomfortable scenario, and maybe I'm having a camping trip or a hiking trip, or I'm doing something like that, I want to be thriving. I don't want to be surviving, right? Because you can only survive for so long, and survival is a crisis mode. And then obviously the next step down is dying. And you know what? Sometimes it takes a long time for a human being to die. So maybe you're freezing your ass off in your cocoon wet sleeping bag, but you make it 10 hours to the next morning, and then somehow miraculously you survived the night. Well, that's not what I want. I want to sleep in an environment that's dry and warm and comfortable and cozy. And I want to wake up feeling refreshed. I just think it's irresponsible to recommend techniques that invite risk versus avoid it. And it was strange is because the guy was clearly recognizing that getting wet is dangerous and doing these things can increase your chances of getting wet. And it just seems silly. The second one was a guy, and this is even more funny, that was talking about how he, as part of his daily routine, exposes himself to cold temperatures because it believes he is acclimating his body to be able to survive in frigid conditions. And he was saying he goes out in the cold in his underwear. He stays in his house with all the windows open and no heat on in his underwear. And as it starts to get cold, he starts to wear less and less clothing around his house. First he'll take off his sweater, then he takes off his shirt, and he's exposing his body to stress. And what I think he's doing is called conditioning. I don't believe it's acclimation. Is the point that he was making. And he went on to cite evidence as to, in ancient times and when the United States was settled, people didn't have things like centralized heat, and they didn't have things like Gore-Tex, and they didn't have all the materials that we have today to keep you warm. And he was saying that these people survived because they had built up tolerances to the cold. And I think that that's partially true, but I think that it's kind of bad science. It's bad figuring. And the reason I'll say that is that evolutionary changes take place over generations, multiple generations, hundreds of generations, not one generation. And so that's why when you have folks that are indigenous to certain areas before the earth was explored and repopulated, you have the people that live on the Ivory Coast of Africa are different as a result of genetic evolution than the people who lived in Alaska, for example, who are different than the people, the Aboriginal tribes of Australia, who are different than the Nordic people of Northern Europe, who are different than the folks in Asia. Those folks evolved to live in those conditions by survival of the fittest, right? People didn't change the structure of their anatomy in one generation. It was through subtle change as they evolved as a species. So it's just silly to think that, hey, I can sit in my house with the windows open in my underwear and somehow there's a metamorphosis in my body that allows me to survive in the cold. What I really think happens is there's some conditioning that takes place there. And as a result of that conditioning, exposing your body to stress, you become used to that stress, and then you deal with the stress a little bit better. Maybe you don't shiver as much, and maybe you don't shiver as fast, but at the end of the day, we are made up of meat, bones, and water. And that stuff freezes at a consistent temperature, regardless of who you are and where you're from. Exposing yourself to cold and exposing yourself to heat doesn't change the fact that you can get a burn, you can get frostbite, you can become hypo or hyperthermic and die. And the other thing is that, he's talking about these people that lived long ago. Their life expectancy was significantly shorter than life expectancy today. And it's because they were continually exposed to dangerous elements. It's not that they lived as long as we do and magically grew some sort of protection against the cold because they were exposed to it. That's not the case at all. And when you take a look at the way that society is today, the world is expanding from a population standpoint at an accelerated rate because we're thriving. We're thriving as a result of better farming techniques. We're thriving as a result of better food production, better medicine, and also staying warm and protecting ourselves from the element better than we ever have. When you look at some of these older civilizations, cultures, and early explorers of the earth, they didn't do so well. They didn't fare so well. Disease was rampant. Life expectancy was short. And a lot of people didn't make it. So, really, that's about it. I think we're getting done here. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about these guys. And it's just, in my opinion, it's so irresponsible to produce information that is so flawed and then project it as fact and project yourself as some kind of expert and then act like, oh, you just don't understand because I'm doing the deal and you're just watching it. So anyhow, that's it, guys. Just want to do a quick video. Thanks.